Let yourself settle in now. Close your eyes, or simply let your gaze soften as we prepare to travel back in time. We are going to a place where the air is thick and warm, heavy with the scent of tropical rain and salt water. We are going to an island at the very tip of the Malay Peninsula, a place that was never supposed to make it alone. Before we drift deeper into the humid air of the past, I would kindly invite you to support this channel. A simple click to like this video or subscribe costs you nothing, yet it means the world to us and is a great help in keeping these stories alive. Feel free to leave a comment as well. I always value hearing your thoughts. Thank you. Now, let us return to the island. Imagine the year is 1965. It is August. The morning air is sticky, the kind of humidity that clings to your skin the moment you step outside. In the modern world, this island is a city of glass and steel, air-conditioned and manicured to perfection. But where we are now, in 1965, the city is low, crowded and loud. There are no gleaming towers yet. Instead, there are rows of shophouses with peeling paint, their terracotta roof tiles darkened by decades of monsoon rains. The streets are narrow, filled with the sounds of bicycle bells, the shouting of hawkers selling noodle soup, and the clucking of chickens in alleyways. The air smells of charcoal smoke, dried fish, and the muddy banks of the river that winds through the center of town like a dark artery. It is a Monday morning, August 9th, but there is a tension in the air that is thicker than the heat. For 2 years, this island, Singapore, had been part of a larger country, Malaysia. It was a marriage of convenience, intended to secure the future. But the marriage has failed. In a television studio, a man sits before a camera. He is wearing a simple white shirt, open at the collar. This is Lee Kuan Yew. He is 41 years old, a lawyer, a fighter, a man known for his sharp intellect and unsentimental view of the world. But today, he is struggling to keep his composure. He looks into the lens, his eyes heavy. He tells his people that Singapore is leaving Malaysia. They are being cast out. They are on their own. At one point in the broadcast, he stops. The weight of the moment crushes him. He asks for the recording to be paused. He takes a handkerchief and wipes tears from his eyes. It is a moment of profound vulnerability that will be etched into the history of the nation. To understand why this is so terrifying, and why it makes for such a remarkable story, you have to understand what Singapore was at this moment. It was a tiny island with no natural resources. It had no coal. It had no oil. It didn't even have enough fresh water to sustain its population. The water had to be piped in from the mainland they had just separated from. It had no army to defend itself. It was surrounded by larger neighbors who were not always friendly. In the eyes of the world, Singapore was not a country. It was a port city that had lost its hinterland. It was a heart cut out of a body, trying to beat on its own. Most economic experts in London and New York looked at the map and shook their heads. They predicted collapse. They saw a place with deep racial divisions, frequent riots, and grinding poverty. They saw a swampy, tropical outpost with no future. But as the sun set on that first day of independence, casting long shadows over the chaotic, bustling streets of Chinatown and the quiet, palm-lined villages of the coast, a different resolve was forming. The man in the white shirt went home. He did not sleep well that night. The burden was immense. But in the quiet of the tropical night, with the sound of the cicadas humming in the trees, a vision began to crystallize. If they were to survive, they could not just be ordinary. An ordinary island with no resources would perish. To survive, they had to be extraordinary. They had to do what seemed impossible. They had to take this muddy, chaotic, impoverished port and turn it into something the world had never seen before. They had to build a garden out of a slum. They had to build wealth out of nothing but their own discipline and wit. As you listen to this, imagine the stillness of that first night of independence. The uncertainty hanging over the rooftops. The quiet fear in the hearts of the people sleeping on woven mats in crowded tenements. They did not know it yet, but they were standing at the starting line of the greatest economic sprint in history. The chaos was about to give way to order. The mud was about to give way to concrete. And the tears of that morning were the watering of a seed that would grow into a mighty tree. Breathe in deeply now. Let the humid, tropical air of 1965 fill your lungs, and then let it go. We are about to watch a nation build itself, brick by brick, law by law, tree by tree. Let us descend now from the high drama of political separation and step onto the solid, uneven ground of the island itself. To understand the miracle of the future, we must first fully inhabit the reality of the past. Imagine walking out into the Singapore of the mid-1960s. The first thing that hits you is not the sights, but the air itself. It is heavy, laden with moisture from the South China Sea. But mixed with the scent of salt is the unmistakable odor of a city struggling to breathe. In these days, Singapore is not a garden city. It is a city of mud and wooden planks. If you were to walk along the banks of the Singapore River today, you would see tourists sipping iced tea, gleaming statues, and the reflection of skyscrapers in water so clean that otters swim in it. But in the era we are visiting, the river is the weary workhorse of the island. It is thick, black, and opaque. For 100 years, this river has been the center of trade. Hundreds of small wooden boats, known as tongkangs and tuakaos, are jammed together so tightly that in some places you could almost walk across the river by stepping from one boat to another. These boats are the lifeblood of the economy, ferrying rubber, tin, and spices from the great ships anchored in the harbor to the warehouses on the quaysway. But the river is also a sewer. There is no modern sanitation for the thousands of people living in the shophouses that line the banks. Everything goes into the water. Oil from the boats, waste from the markets, debris from the construction. The smell of the river is legendary, a pungent mix of sulfur, brackish water, and decay. It is the smell of poverty, but also the smell of commerce. It is the smell of survival. Move away from the river now, and let's walk into the residential areas. You won't find high-rise apartments yet. Instead, the vast majority of the population lives in what are called kampongs. These are villages, often unplanned and sprawling, built of timber and zinc sheets. Imagine navigating a maze of wooden walkways raised on stilts. Beneath you, the ground is muddy and prone to flooding whenever the monsoon rains sweep in. The houses are close together, huddled for support. The roofs are made of corrugated tin, which amplifies the sound of the rain into a deafening roar during a storm, but bakes the interior like an oven when the midday sun strikes. Inside these homes, life is cramped. A family of 7 or 8 might share a single room. There is no privacy. The sounds of the neighbors, arguments, laughter, the crying of babies, the static of a radio, drift through the thin walls. It is a communal existence, born of necessity. There is a distinct lack of basic amenities that we take for granted today. In these years, one of the most common sights in the early morning is the night soil man. Since there are few flushing toilets, waste is collected in buckets. Every morning, laborers perform the grim task of collecting these buckets from the shophouses and kampongs. It is a humble, difficult existence, a stark reminder of how far the infrastructure lags behind the modern world. And yet, despite the squalor, there is a vibrant, chaotic energy here. Picture the streets of Chinatown at dusk. As the heat of the day breaks, the streets fill with people. Hawkers set up their pushcarts, lighting kerosene lamps that cast a warm, flickering glow over the faces of the diners. The air fills with the smoke of charcoal grills, the scent of frying garlic and chili, and the sweet aroma of roasting chestnuts. People sit on small wooden stools, eating bowls of noodles for a few cents. There is a sense of resilience here. These people, Chinese coolies, Malay fishermen, Indian traders, have come from all over Asia to find a living. They are tough. They are accustomed to hardship. They work long hours on the docks or in the rubber processing plants, their bodies lean and weathered by the tropical sun. But there is a fragility to this life. The housing is dangerous. The structures are dry, old wood. Fire is a constant, terrifying phantom that haunts the city. One spark is all it takes. When a fire starts in a kampong, with the wind blowing off the sea, it moves with terrifying speed. There are no fire hydrants in the maze of alleyways. There is no way for fire trucks to reach the center of the village. The people live with the knowledge that everything they own, their meager savings hidden under a mattress, their family photos, their clothes, could be gone in an hour. This fear is a low hum in the background of daily life, a reminder of their vulnerability. Beyond the city center, the island is still wild. There are swamps teeming with mosquitoes, spreading malaria and dengue fever. There are pig farms where the waste runs directly into the streams. There are tigers, though rare by now, that still exist in the cultural memory of the older generation who remember when the jungle covered everything. It is a place of stark contrasts. You have the colonial grandeur of the City Hall and the Supreme Court, with their white columns and British architecture, standing like ghosts of an empire that has just packed up and left. And right next to them, you have the teeming, sweating, struggling masses of the kampongs. The unemployment rate is high. Young men stand on street corners with nothing to do. This idleness is dangerous. In a city with deep racial and religious divisions, frustration can easily turn into violence. Riots have broken out before, sudden and bloody, turning neighbors against one another. The police force is stretched thin, struggling to maintain order in a city that feels like a pressure cooker. This is the inheritance of the new government. This is the hand of cards that Lee Kuan Yew and his team have been dealt. When the foreign journalists look at Singapore in 1965, they do not see a future financial hub. They see a slum. They see a place that is too crowded, too poor, and too divided to survive. They see a basket case of the third world. But if you look closely, you can see the raw materials of the miracle. You see a people who are willing to work. You see a geography that sits right at the crossroads of the East and West. And you see a hunger, a deep, burning desire to climb out of the mud. As night falls over the island in our story, the kerosene lamps flicker out one by one. The sounds of the city fade to a murmur. The air cools slightly, though the humidity remains. Thousands of people lie down on their mats, listening to the geckos chirping on the walls, dreaming of a better life. They cannot imagine yet that the mud beneath their houses will one day be solid granite pavement. They cannot imagine that the dark river will one day sparkle. They cannot imagine that their children will grow up to be some of the wealthiest, best educated citizens on the planet. But the plan is already being drawn, the dreamers are awake, and the transformation is about to begin. The sun rises over the chaotic, colorful streets of 1965 Singapore, But now we must leave the heat of the pavement and step into the cool, quiet corridors of power. To understand how a swamp becomes a metropolis, you must understand the mind of the gardener. And in the case of Singapore, the head gardener was a man named Lee Kuan Yew. He was not a king, nor a general. He was a lawyer. If you were to see him in those early days, walking through the halls of the Istana, the grand white colonial palace that served as the office of the government, you would not see a man dressed in the finery of a dictator. You would see a man in a simple, open-necked white shirt and beige trousers. This was not an accident. It was a uniform. In a region of the world where politics was often associated with corruption, with generals in medal-laden uniforms or sultans in silk, Lee Kuan Yew and his team, the People's Action Party, chose to wear white. It was a symbol of purity. It was a visual promise to the people. We are incorruptible. We are here to work, not to rule. Lee Kuan Yew, or Harry, as he was known in his youth, was a man of intense, almost terrifying intellect. He had studied law at Cambridge in England, graduating with a double first-class honours, the highest distinction possible. He spoke English with a perfect, clipped eloquence that could charm British prime ministers, but he could also switch to Malay or Mandarin to rally the crowds on the streets of Singapore. But he was not a warm, cuddly figure. He was unsentimental. He was pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness. He looked at the world not as he wished it to be, but exactly as it was. Imagine sitting across the desk from him in those early years. The room is sparse. The air conditioning is humming. Lee Kuan Yew famously believed that air conditioning was one of the greatest inventions of history because it allowed for clear thinking in the tropics. He's looking at a map of his tiny island. He knows the odds. He knows that history is littered with small states that were swallowed up by larger neighbors. He knows that nobody owes Singapore a living. His philosophy was simple and stark: survival. He often told his people, "We have to be rugged." This became a catchphrase of the era, the rugged society. He believed that because Singapore had no natural wealth, its only resource was its people. And so, the people had to be tougher, smarter, and more disciplined than anyone else in the region. "Poetry is a luxury we cannot afford," he once said. "What is important is to eat." This was the mindset that filtered down from the top. There was no time for idle dreaming. Every decision, every law, every policy had to answer one question: does this make us stronger? Does this help us survive? But Lee was not working alone. It is important to remember that this was not a one-man show. He was surrounded by a team of equally brilliant, serious men, the old guard. There was Goh Keng Swee, the economic architect. He was a quiet, bookish man who would perform the miracle of industrialization. While Lee was the face and the voice, Goh was the brain in the back room, crunching the numbers, figuring out how to lure factories to a place that had nothing to offer but willing hands. There was Rajaratnam, the philosopher of the group, who dreamed of a Singapore where race didn't matter, where everyone was simply Singaporean. They were a group of serious men in a serious time. They did not live in luxury. They did not build statues of themselves. They were obsessed with efficiency. Corruption was a cancer they cut out immediately. If a government official was caught taking a bribe, even a small one, there was no mercy. It didn't matter if they were a friend or a loyal party member. They were punished. This created a culture of clean governance that was almost unheard of in the developing world. Investors from America and Europe, used to paying bribes to get factories built in Asia, were shocked when they came to Singapore. Here, the answer was no. Here, the laws were the laws. This stability was the first product Singapore had to sell. But there was a softer side to this rigid discipline, a vision of what the city could be. Lee Kuan Yew was not just concerned with economics, he was obsessed with the physical environment. He was a man who noticed the details. Driven through the city in his car, he would look out the window and see weeds growing in the cracks of the pavement, or a row of trees that looked yellow and sick. He would write a note. The next morning, the Parks Department would receive a memo. Fix the trees. He believed that a clean, green city was not just for aesthetics. It was a signal to the world. He reasoned that if international businessmen came to Singapore and saw a city that was manicured, disciplined, and lush with greenery, they would trust that the government was equally disciplined. They would invest their millions here. So, the man in white became the head gardener. He launched tree planting campaigns personally. He read books on botany to find out which trees could survive the exhaust fumes of cars. He chose trees that would provide broad shade to cool the streets. It is a strange and calming image. This stern, Cambridge-educated lawyer, facing existential threats and potential wars, taking the time to choose exactly which species of creeper should be planted on a retaining wall to hide the concrete. It showed a care for the details. It showed a belief that things could be better. Under his watch, the government began to reshape the very mindset of the population. They were told to stop spitting on the streets. They were told to flush public toilets. They were urged to be courteous. It was a campaign of social engineering, yes, but it was driven by a desire to lift the people up, to make them citizens of a first world country before the country itself was actually first world. As the late 1960s progressed, the lights in the government offices burned late into the night. The old guard sat around tables filled with smoke and coffee cups, debating the future. They were anxious, they were exhausted, but they were united. They were building a machine made of laws, education, and concrete. A machine designed to take a fishing village and launch it into the future. And the fuel for this machine was the sheer force of will of the man in the white shirt. He would not let Singapore fail. If he had to drag the country forward by the scruff of its neck, he would do it. Now that we have met the architects, we must look at the blueprint they were staring at. And when they looked at the map of Singapore in the late 1960s, they did not see a fortress. They saw a sitting duck. Let your mind drift upwards now, imagining a view from high above the earth. Look down at the region of Southeast Asia. You see the vast green landmass of Malaysia, stretching down like a finger. You see the thousands of islands of Indonesia, scattered like emeralds across the equator. And tucked right in the middle, barely a dot, is Singapore. It is small. So small that on many world maps, the name of the country has to be written out in the ocean because it won't fit on the land itself. For over 100 years, this smallness hadn't mattered because Singapore was protected by the British Empire. It was the Gibraltar of the East. The naval base at Sembawang was massive, filled with aircraft carriers and destroyers. The sight of the British flag and the sound of British bugles gave the island a sense of invincibility. But in 1968, a shockwave hit the island that was just as devastating as the separation from Malaysia. The British government announced that they were leaving. They were pulling their military forces out east of Suez. They were packing up. For Lee Kuan Yew and his team, this was a nightmare. It wasn't just about safety, though the thought of being left undefended was terrifying. It was about money. The British military bases contributed to nearly 20% of Singapore's entire economy. Tens of thousands of people worked on the bases as cooks, cleaners, mechanics, and clerks. In one stroke, Singapore was losing its bodyguard and its biggest employer. The clock began to tick. They had only a few years before the ships would sail away for the last time. But the vulnerability went deeper than money or guns. It went to the very essence of life: water. Imagine turning on a tap in your home. You expect water to flow cool and clear. It is a certainty of modern life. But in Singapore, every drop of water that flowed from a tap was a reminder of their dependence. The island did not have enough rivers or lakes to collect rain. Nearly all of its water came through two giant pipelines that ran across the causeway from Malaysia. This was the lifeline. And it was a lifeline that could be cut. Every time there was a political disagreement with their neighbors, the threat hung in the air. We will turn off the tap. It was a terrifying leverage. A nation without water dies in days. This existential fear, the fear of thirst, became the driving force behind the country's obsession with survival. It is why, even today, if you visit Singapore, you will see that water is treated with a reverence that borders on the spiritual. So, how does a vulnerable island respond to these threats? It does not panic, it prepares. First, they had to build a shield. But how do you build an army when you have no soldiers, no officers, and no tradition of warfare? They looked for help. They wrote to countries around the world, asking for advisors. Many ignored them. But one small country answered, a country that knew exactly what it was like to be small, surrounded, and fighting for survival: Israel. It was a secret mission. The Israeli military advisors arrived in Singapore quietly. They could not wear their uniforms. They could not be identified for fear of angering Singapore's Muslim neighbors. They were referred to in official documents as Mexicans or agricultural advisors. Under the cover of tropical heat, these Mexicans began to train the first generation of Singaporean officers. They taught them how to organize, how to march, and how to defend their home. This led to the creation of national service. It was a bold decision. The government decreed that every young man, upon turning 18, would serve 2 years in the military or police. Think of the social impact of this. In a society that was deeply divided by race, where Chinese, Malays, and Indians often lived in separate villages and spoke separate languages, the army became the great mixing bowl. Picture the scene at the training camps. You have the son of a wealthy banker sleeping in a bunk next to the son of a hawker. You have a boy who speaks only Hokkien learning to march next to a boy who speaks only Tamil. They shaved their heads. They wore the same green uniform. They ate the same food. They suffered through the same push-ups in the mud and the rain. Slowly, sweating together in the jungle training grounds, they stopped seeing each other as Chinese or Malay. They started seeing each other as squad mates. They started seeing themselves as Singaporeans. This vulnerability, which could have destroyed the nation, was used to build it. The fear of being invaded created a disciplined, cohesive society. And what of the water? The government began to look at every drop of rain that fell on the island as a precious diamond. They began to dam up the rivers. They turned estuaries into reservoirs. They realized that to be truly free, they had to catch every single drop of water that fell from the sky. This was the beginning of a 50-year engineering marvel. They started cleaning the catchment areas. They laid miles of pipes. They began to dream of technology that could recycle water or even take the salt out of the sea. It was a slow process. It involved digging up roads and laying drains. It involved telling people they could no longer throw trash in the canals. But there is something deeply soothing about this kind of competence. It is the feeling of a household being put in order. As the British ships finally weighed anchor in the early 1970s, sailing out of the harbour with their flags fluttering, they left behind a quiet harbour. The great protectors were gone. The people of Singapore stood on the shore, watching them go. The silence they left behind was heavy, but it was not empty. Behind the silence was the sound of construction, the sound of piles being driven into the mud, the sound of marching boots on the parade square, the sound of water rushing into new reservoirs. The island was alone. It was vulnerable, but it was waking up. It was realizing that if no one else was going to save them, they would have to save themselves, and they were just stubborn enough to do it. We have secured the borders, and we have secured the water. But now, we must face the silent, gnawing problem that kept the leaders awake at night: hunger. In the late 1960s, Singapore was teeming with people, but it was starving for work. The unemployment rate was climbing towards double digits. Every year, thousands of young people left school with bright eyes and hope, only to find that there were no jobs for them. They stood on street corners. They sat in coffee shops. Their idleness was a ticking time bomb. Lee Kuan Yew knew that you cannot build a nation on speeches. You can only build it on bread and butter. The traditional way for a developing country to grow was to protect its own small businesses, to put up high walls and tariffs so that the local shoemaker didn't have to compete with the big factories of the West. This was the fashionable economic theory of the time. But the economic architect of Singapore, Dr. Goh Kang Swee, looked at that theory and threw it in the trash. He realized that Singapore was too small. If they only sold shoes to each other, they would remain poor forever. To get rich, they had to sell to the world. They had to leapfrog their neighbors and connect directly with the giants: America, Europe, Japan. And so, he proposed a gamble that seemed bordering on madness. He pointed a finger at the western corner of the island. It was a place called Jurong. At that time, Jurong was nothing. It was a dismal landscape of mangrove swamps, crocodile-infested rivers, and prawn farms. It was wild, wet, and muddy. Goh Keng Swee said, "We are going to clear this, all of it, and we are going to build factories." The critics laughed. They called it Goh's folly. They said, "Who will come? Who will put $1 million factory in a swamp in Southeast Asia?" But Dr. Goh did not listen to the laughter. He listened to the sound of the bulldozers. Imagine the sheer physical effort of this undertaking. It is a deeply soothing image of transformation, man bringing order to chaos. An army of earth movers descended on the swamps of Jurong. They didn't just clear the trees, they leveled hills. They took the earth from the high ground and used it to fill in the marshes. It was a massive terraforming project. Day and night, the engines roared, pushing the red earth into the black water, creating solid, flat land where there had been none before. They built roads that went to nowhere. They laid power lines for buildings that did not exist yet. They built a port. And then, silence. For a long time, the factories stood empty. The wind blew through the empty lots. The critics laughed louder. "See, it is a ghost town. It is Goh's folly." But the government was already on the move. They sent teams of young, bright Singaporeans to pack their bags and fly to America and Europe. They were salesmen for a country that nobody had heard of. They knocked on the doors of the biggest companies in the world: Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, General Electric. Picture a young Singaporean official sitting in a glass boardroom in New York or Dallas. He is trying to convince a skeptical American CEO to move his production to a tiny island thousands of miles away. "Why should we go there?" the CEO asks. "It's risky. It's in the tropics." And the Singaporean official replies, "Because we will make it easy for you. We will give you a tax holiday. We have built the factories for you. They are ready. We have a port. But most of all, we have the people. Our people speak English," he would say. "They are disciplined. They are hungry. They will work harder than anyone else." And slowly, the tide turned. The first brave companies took the bait. Texas Instruments agreed to set up a semiconductor assembly line. And then, the magic happened. The first ships arrived at the new Jurong port. They brought heavy machinery. They brought crates of raw materials. And suddenly, the empty shells of the factories began to hum. It was a new sound for the island. The rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of stamping machines. The high-pitched whine of drills. The hiss of soldering irons. Thousands of young women, who previously had no way to earn a living, put on uniforms. They sat in rows in air-conditioned clean rooms, peering through microscopes, assembling the tiny electronic brains that would power the modern world. They were making transistor radios. They were making chips. They were making toys. For the first time, these women had their own money. They could buy nice clothes. They could help their parents. A sense of pride began to swell in the working class. The Goes Folly label was quietly forgotten. The swamp had become an engine. As you listen to this, visualize the lights of Jurong turning on at dusk. A grid of amber streetlights illuminating the straight, wide roads. The smoke rising from the chimneys, not dark, choking smoke, but the white steam of industry, signaling productivity. The ships kept coming. The Project Tangier Made in Singapore label began to appear on products around the world. It was a masterstroke of strategy. By inviting the multinational corporations, MNCs, in, Singapore did two things. First, they created jobs instantly. But secondly, and perhaps more brilliantly, they made themselves indispensable. If an American company had $100 million invested in a factory in Singapore, the American government would want to make sure Singapore remained safe. By hosting the world's businesses, Singapore was buying its own security. The gamble had paid off. The swamp was gone. In its place was the foundation of a first-world economy. But factories are just buildings. Machines are just metal. To truly succeed, the government knew they needed to do something even harder. They needed to give these workers a reason to stay. They needed to give them something to fight for. They needed to give them a home. We leave the hum of the factories now and follow the workers home. But in the mid-1960s, home was still a dangerous word for many. As we touched upon earlier, the wooden kampongs were tinderboxes waiting for a spark, and that spark came many times, but never more tragically than in the great fires that swept through settlements like Bukit Ho Swee. Imagine the terror of those nights, the wind howling off the sea, whipping the flames from one thatched roof to another faster than a man could run. In a matter of hours, thousands of families would find themselves standing in the ashes, holding nothing but the clothes on their backs. The psychological toll of this insecurity was immense. How can a person dream of the future when they are terrified of losing the present? Lee Kuan Yew and his team understood a fundamental truth. A man who has nothing to lose is dangerous. A man who owns a home has something to protect. And so, they created the HDB, the Housing and Development Board. Their mission was simple, but the scale was staggering. They had to house a nation. They had to take hundreds of thousands of people out of the mud and put them into the sky. The construction that followed was not just an engineering feat. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic drumbeat of progress. Picture the skyline of the island in the late 60s and early 70s. Everywhere you looked, there were cranes. They stood like giant steel stalks against the tropical blue sky, dipping and bowing, lifting buckets of concrete. The HDB built with a speed that the world had rarely seen. They were completing a new apartment every 45 minutes. It was a conveyor belt of homes. These were not the glass-walled luxury penthouses of today. These were the classic HDB blocks. They were rectangular, solid, and white. They were designed for the tropics. They had long, open corridors that allowed the monsoon breezes to sweep through, cooling the building naturally. Imagine the day a family moves from a kampong to their new flat. For a family that has lived for generations in a wooden shack with a dirt floor, this is not just a move, it is a journey to another planet. They pack their belongings into a lorry. They drive away from the village, past the ducks and the mud, and arrive at the foot of a towering white cliff of concrete. They take the elevator, a miracle in itself, up to the 10th floor. The father takes a metal key. He puts it into the lock. Click. The door swings open. Inside, the space is simple. The floors are tiled with cool, smooth terrazzo. The walls are white and smell of fresh lime wash. There is light pouring in from the windows. But the true miracle is in the kitchen and the bathroom. The mother turns a tap and clean, drinkable water gushes out. She pushes a handle and the toilet flushes. There is no more night soil bucket. There is no more hauling water from the village well. There is just clean, white, hygienic order. For the first few nights, it is strange. It is too quiet. They miss the sound of the crickets and the neighbors talking through the thin walls. They are high up in the air, separated from the earth. But soon, a deep sense of peace settles in. When the rainstorms come now, they do not worry about the roof leaking. They do not worry about the river rising to flood their beds. They are safe. They are dry. They are secure in a fortress of concrete. This security changed the psychology of the people. When you are not worried about your house burning down, you can focus on your children's homework. You can focus on saving money. You can focus on the future. But the government went one step further. They didn't just want to rent these apartments to the people. They wanted the people to own them. They introduced the home ownership scheme. They allowed people to use their pension savings, the Central Provident Fund, to pay for their flats. This was a stroke of genius. Suddenly, a taxi driver, a hawker, or a factory worker could say, "This is mine." And because Singapore is a multiracial nation, the HDB became a tool for harmony. The government implemented a policy to ensure that every block had a mix of races. A Chinese family lived next to a Malay family, who lived next to an Indian family. They shared the same elevators. Their children played together in the void decks, the open, breezy spaces on the ground floor of the buildings. They smelled the cooking of each other's festivals. Slowly, the suspicion of the racial riots began to fade, replaced by the mundane, neighborly rhythm of high-rise living. As you drift through this part of the story, visualize the sun setting over a new town like Toa Payoh or Queenstown. The white slab blocks are turning gold in the evening light. You see thousands of windows lighting up, one by one. Behind each window is a family, safe and secure. You hear the clatter of dinner plates, the sound of televisions, the laughter of children. It is a massive, vertical village. It is not romantic in the way a thatched cottage is romantic, but it is beautiful in its utility. It is beautiful because it works. The slum is gone. The anxiety of the fire is gone. In its place is a nation of homeowners, each with a key in their pocket, each with a small square of the sky to call their own. They have built a shell to protect themselves. Now, they were ready to make it beautiful. They were ready to plant the garden. The factories were humming, and the people were safe in their new high-rise homes. But Lee Kuan Yew looked out at his city and saw a problem. It was becoming a jungle of concrete. The white HDB blocks were practical, yes, but they were stark. The new roads were efficient, but they were hot, radiating the tropical sun back into the air. The city was grey, dusty, and utilitarian. Lee knew that for the human spirit to thrive, and for the city to be truly livable, it needed to breathe. He didn't just want a city that survived. He wanted a city that felt like a sanctuary. And so, in 1967, he introduced a vision that would define Singapore for the rest of history. He announced that Singapore would become a garden city. This was not a casual slogan. It was a command. It is rare in history for a head of state to be so obsessed with botany. But Lee Kuan Yew approached gardening with the same ruthless efficiency that he applied to economics or national defense. He set up a dedicated parks and trees division. Their orders were simple but overwhelming. Cover the island in green. Imagine the transformation of the streets. The first challenge was the heat. Singapore sits just 1 degree north of the equator. The sun is fierce. Lee wanted trees that would act as natural air conditioning. He didn't want skinny, decorative palms that offered no shade. He wanted giants. He chose the rain tree. If you have ever been to Singapore, you know this tree. It is magnificent. Its branches spread out wide and flat, like a giant green umbrella. It is a tree that seems designed for protection. But there is something else about the rain tree that is perfect for a bedtime story. It has a peculiar habit. As the sun sets and the evening light fades, the leaves of the rain tree fold up. They close upon themselves, allowing the rain to fall through to the roots and allowing the tree to rest. It is a tree that sleeps. Thousands of these trees were planted along the highways and the boulevards. Picture the laborers working in the early morning mist, digging holes along the newly paved roads. They lower the root balls into the earth. They water them. Year by year, the canopy grew. The harsh grey lines of the highways began to disappear under a tunnel of green. Driving from the airport to the city centre became a journey through a park, not a commute through an industrial zone. But the vision went deeper than just trees. Lee Kuan Yew hated the look of bare concrete. He saw the flyovers, the retaining walls, and the overhead bridges as scars on the landscape. So, he issued a directive: hide the concrete. He instructed the gardeners to plant creepers and vines. He wanted green curtains. Visualize the slow, steady growth of nature reclaiming the city. You see the creeping fig vines sending out their tiny tendrils, gripping the rough surface of a concrete pillar. Inch by inch, day by day, they climb. They turn a grey pillar into a vertical column of leaves. They turn a stark retaining wall into a living tapestry of green. The city began to change its temperature. The shade cooled the pavement. The leaves trapped the dust. The air became cleaner. It was a psychological masterstroke. When foreign investors arrived, stepping off their planes into this lush, manicured environment, they felt a sense of calm. They subconsciously felt that a government that could maintain millions of plants so perfectly could surely handle their money with the same care. And for the people living in the high-rises, The parks became their living rooms. Every HDB estate was built with a park. It wasn't an option, it was a requirement. Jogging tracks wound through groves of frangipani trees, filling the air with their sweet, heavy perfume. The government even cared for the birds. They realized that in their rush to build, they had scared away the native bird life. So, they launched a plan to bring them back. They planted fruit trees to attract colorful orioles and hummingbirds. The sound of the city began to change. The roar of traffic was dampened by the thick hedges. The song of birds returned to the mornings. This was a top-down garden. It was manicured to within an inch of its life. If a tree fell during a storm, it was removed and replaced immediately. If a patch of grass turned brown, it was replanted. It was nature, but nature under strict discipline. Yet, the effect was undeniably soothing. There is a famous story that Lee Kuan Yew would carry a notebook with him everywhere. If he saw a dead plant or a weed while being driven to a meeting, he would write it down. The officer in charge of that district would get a call before the Prime Minister even arrived at his office. It showed a love for the land that went beyond politics. As we close this chapter, imagine the island from above again. The brown construction sites of the 1960s are gone. The island is turning into an emerald. The rain trees are folding their leaves for the night. The street lights flicker on, illuminating the boulevards that look like green tunnels. The scent of jasmine and rain hangs in the humid air. The city is no longer just a factory or a shelter. It is becoming a garden. A place where a person can walk under the shade, look up at the leaves, and feel a moment of peace in the middle of the rush. They had built the house. Now, they had planted the garden. But there was one part of the island that was still sick, still dark, and still waiting for its cure: the river. We have greened the streets and housed the people. But in the center of the city, a dark wound remained: the Singapore River. Do you remember how we described it in the beginning? The artery of the city that was clogged with a century of waste. It was the color of strong coffee, thick and opaque. The smell was so potent that people working in the skyscrapers nearby would keep their windows permanently sealed. It was a dead river. No fish could survive in it. It was simply a flowing sewer that carried the filth of the city out to sea. For decades, people assumed this was just the price of progress. The river smells because we are busy, they would say. Pollution is the smell of money. But in 1977, Lee Kuan Yew stood on the Anderson Bridge, looked down at the black water, and decided that this excuse was no longer acceptable. He issued a challenge that sounded impossible. He told his Ministry of the Environment, "In 10 years, I want to see fish swimming in this river." It was a staggering command. Cleaning a river is not like cleaning a room. You cannot just sweep it. A river is a living system. To clean it, you have to change the lives of everyone who lives along its banks. And so began the Great Cleanup. It was a 10-year war against filth. The first step was the hardest. They had to move the people. For generations, thousands of squatters had lived in shacks on the riverbanks. They had no choice but to throw their waste into the water. The government had to gently but firmly move these families into the new HDB flats we spoke of earlier. It was a massive logistical operation, moving 26,000 families. Then, they had to deal with the hawkers. Singapore is famous for its street food, char kway teow, satay laksa. But in the 70s, the street food vendors washed their dirty plates in buckets by the roadside and poured the greasy, spicy water straight into the drains, which flowed straight into the river. The government built hawker centers, clean, covered markets with proper plumbing and grease traps. They told the hawkers, "You must move in here." Many hawkers resisted. They liked the freedom of the streets, but the government was insistent. They built the centers to be bright, airy, and cheap to rent. Slowly, the smell of frying garlic moved off the streets and into these ordered, sanitary halls. Then came the pigs. It is strange to think of now, but Singapore had hundreds of pig farms. The waste from hundreds of thousands of pigs washed into the river system every day. It was a massive source of pollution. The government made the hard economic decision to phase out pig farming entirely. It was better to import pork than to poison the water. Once the sources of pollution were stopped, the real work began. They had to clean the mud. Imagine the dredging barges moving slowly up the river. Huge mechanical claws dipped down into the black water, scraping the bottom. They pulled up decades of debris, old tires, bicycle frames, dead animals, and tons of foul-smelling muck. Day after day, year after year, the barges worked. They scooped out the rot. They laid new sand. They rebuilt the crumbling river walls with clean stone. It was a slow, invisible healing. For a long time, the water still looked brown. The skeptics said it would never work. They said the river was dead forever. But nature is resilient. If you give it a chance, it returns. Around the mid-1980s, reports started coming in. A worker saw a flash of silver in the water, then another. The fish were coming back. At first, they were tough, hardy fish, but as the oxygen levels in the water rose, more delicate species returned. In 1987, exactly 10 years after the challenge was set, the government held a Clean River commemoration. They didn't just cut a ribbon, they did something much more symbolic. Lee Kuan Yew arrived at the riverside. He was handed a bottle of clean water. He poured it into the river. And then, swimming competitions were held. People dove into the water that, just a decade ago, would have made them sick to touch. They swam, they splashed, they kayaked. It was a triumph. Visualize the river as it is today. It is evening. The water is calm and dark, but it is clean. It acts like a mirror. Reflected in the surface, you see the glittering lights of the financial district. You see the heritage bridges, now painted and lit up in gold. You see the bumboats, once the dirty workhorses of the river, now converted into electric sightseeing boats, gliding silently with tourists. And if you are lucky, truly lucky, you might see the ultimate seal of approval. In recent years, a family of smooth-coated otters has moved into the city. These sleek, playful creatures are very fussy. They only live in clean water with plenty of fish. To see a wild otter romping on the banks of the Singapore River, right in the shadow of a 100-story bank, is a surreal and beautiful sight. It is proof that the city and nature can coexist. The smell of sulfur is gone, replaced by the smell of the sea breeze and the faint scent of rain. The river flows quietly now, a healed scar running through the heart of the metropolis. It was the final piece of the physical puzzle. The land was green, the housing was white, and now the water was blue. But a nation is more than just infrastructure. You can build the perfect stage, but the actors must know their lines. To complete the transformation, the government knew they had to engineer something even more complex than a river. They had to engineer the behavior of the people themselves. They had to create a culture of discipline. The river was clean. The trees were growing. The buildings were rising. But Lee Kuan Yew and his team knew that a first-world city could not be inhabited by third-world habits. You can build the most beautiful marble floors in the world, but if people spit on them, they are worthless. You can build high-tech elevators, but if people urinate in them, they become unbearable. And so, the government began a project that was perhaps the most controversial, yet the most transformative of all. They decided to teach a nation how to behave. It started with the basics: hygiene. In the old days of the kampongs, spitting was common. It was a habit born of dust and tuberculosis. But in a modern city of air-conditioned offices and paved streets, it was a health hazard. So the government banned it. They didn't just ask politely, they imposed heavy fines. If you were caught spitting on the street, you paid. Then came the littering. In many cities around the world, throwing a cigarette butt or a wrapper on the ground is a minor indiscretion. In Singapore, it became a crime against the community. Critics in the West mocked this. They called Singapore a nanny state. They made jokes about the fine city, where you could be fined for chewing gum, fined for not flushing the toilet, fined for eating on the train. But for the people living there, the perspective was different. Imagine stepping onto a subway train. In New York or London during the 1980s, the trains were often covered in graffiti, smelling of stale food, with sticky floors. Now, imagine the Singapore MRT. You step into the carriage. It is cool. It is silent. The floor is spotless. The seats are clean. There is no smell of old hamburgers or spilled coffee because nobody is eating. The strictness created a sanctuary. The rules were not there to oppress. They were there to protect the shared space. It was a collective agreement. We will all restrain ourselves a little bit so that we can all enjoy a pristine environment. But the government didn't just use the stick. They also used the carrot. They used charm. They introduced a mascot. His name was Singer. He was a smiling orange lion. He was the face of the National Courtesy Campaign. You saw him everywhere, on banners, on TV, on badges pinned to school children's shirts. His message was simple: make courtesy our way of life. It sounds almost childlike, doesn't it? A government teaching its people to say please and thank you, to give up their seats to the elderly, to queue patiently for the bus. But it worked. Year by year, the rough edges of the old port city began to smooth out. The pushing and shoving diminished. The queues became orderly lines. A culture of consideration began to take root. However, the most profound result of this discipline was not just cleanliness, it was safety. In the 1950s and 60s, Singapore had a problem with secret societies, gangs that ran protection rackets, fought with knives, and controlled the underworld. The government waged a relentless war against them. They used tough laws that allowed them to detain gang leaders without trial. It was harsh. It was criticized by human rights groups, but it shattered the gangs. The result is a sensation that is almost unique to Singapore in the modern world. The feeling of absolute safety. Visualize this scene to understand the value of that order. It is 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The city is asleep. A young woman finishes her shift at a restaurant. She walks out onto the street. In almost any other major city in the world, be it Paris, New York, or Rio, she would be vigilant. She would check over her shoulder. She would hold her keys tightly in her hand. She would stick to the shadows or rush to a taxi. But here, she walks slowly. She has headphones on, listening to music. She takes a shortcut through a park. The streetlights buzz softly. She is not afraid. The thought of being mugged does not even cross her mind. She is safer here, alone in the dark, than she would be in her own home in many other countries. This creates a deep, subconscious relaxation in the population. When you remove the fear of violence, you remove a massive weight from the human psyche. Parents let their children take the bus to school alone at age 7. People leave their laptops on coffee shop tables while they go to the bathroom, knowing they will still be there when they return. It is a low-trust world turned into a high-trust society through the sheer force of law. Yes, the fines are real. Yes, the laws are strict. Drug traffickers face the death penalty, a grim and uncompromising stance that the government refuses to apologize for. They argue that the lives of thousands saved from addiction are worth the harshness of the law. Whether you agree with the philosophy or not, the atmosphere it creates is undeniable. It is an atmosphere of calm predictability. There is a soothing rhythm to a city that works. You know the bus will come on time. You know the streets will be clean. You know you are safe. In a chaotic world, Singapore became a bubble of order, a place where the systems worked so well they became invisible. The people had learned to live together in their high-rise towers. They had learned to keep their garden clean. They had learned to be courteous. And now, with a stable, safe, and disciplined society, they were ready to take the next step. They were ready to stop just working in factories. They were ready to start speaking the language of the world. They were ready to become global. We have built the hardware of the nation, the ports, the flats, the reservoirs. Now we must look at the software. In the 1960s, Singapore was a Tower of Babel. If you walked down a single street, you might hear a dozen different tongues. The Chinese majority didn't just speak Chinese. They spoke Hokkien, Teochew, Cantonese, and Hainanese. Dialects so different that often they could not understand one another. The Malays spoke Malay. The Indians spoke Tamil or Malayalam. It was a cultural richness, yes, but it was an economic nightmare. How do you build a unified workforce when the foreman cannot speak to the worker? How do you sell products to the world when your people cannot speak to the buyers? And more dangerously, language was a wall that divided the races. A Chinese boy who went to a Chinese school, read Chinese books, learned Chinese history, and lived in a Chinese mental world. He had nothing in common with the Malay boy living a mile away. Lee Kuan Yew faced a choice that would have paralyzed a lesser leader. The easy political choice would have been to elevate Mandarin to please the majority, or to elevate Malay, the language of the region. But Lee chose neither. He chose the language of the enemy. He chose the language of the colonizer. He chose English. It was a purely pragmatic decision. He looked at the world map and saw that the Americans were the dominant economic force. He saw that science, technology, and banking were all conducted in English. To survive, he said, we must plug ourselves into the global grid. And so, a quiet revolution began in the classrooms. Imagine a small schoolhouse in the 1970s. The windows are open to catch the breeze. The ceiling fans are spinning. Inside, you see a row of children. They look different. Some have fair skin, some brown, some dark. But they are all holding the same book. They are learning. A is for apple. B is for ball. It was not easy. For many parents, this felt like a betrayal of their culture. Why should their children speak the white man's tongue? There were tears. There were protests. The old vernacular schools, which taught only in Chinese or Tamil, were slowly phased out or converted. It was a painful severing of roots for the sake of the fruit. But the government held firm. They implemented a bilingual policy. Every child must learn English as their first language, to survive in the economy. But they must also learn their mother tongue, Mandarin, Malay or Tamil, to keep their cultural anchor so they would not forget who they were. Watch the result of this decision unfold over a single generation. Fast forward to a boardroom in the 1990s. An American investor flies in from San Francisco. He is tired. He is worried about miscommunication. He walks into a meeting in Singapore. He is greeted by a young Singaporean executive. The executive speaks perfect, grammatically precise English. The jokes land. The nuances of the contract are understood immediately. There is no translator needed. There is no friction. The investor signs the deal. This happened thousands of times. It became Singapore's superpower. It was the only country in Asia where a Western company could set up a regional headquarters and feel completely at home linguistically. It was an Asian country with a Western operating system. But the language policy did something even more important than making money. It created peace. English became the neutral ground. It was nobody's native language, so it was fair to everyone. When a Chinese Singaporean met an Indian Singaporean, they didn't have to struggle. They switched to English. It became the glue that held the multiracial society together. As you listen, picture the pledge-taking ceremony that happens in every school in Singapore, every single morning. Thousands of children in crisp white uniforms stand in lines in the school courtyards. The morning sun is just rising. They raise their right fists over their hearts. They recite the national pledge, and they recite it in English. We, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion. These words, repeated every day for 10, 12 years, seeped into the subconscious of the nation. The distinct tribes of the past began to blur. A new identity emerged. They were no longer just Chinese, Malay, or Indian. They were Singaporean. They developed their own flavor of English, too, Singlish, a colorful, efficient, rapid-fire slang that mixes all the dialects together. Can or not. Shuk, Alamak. While the government frowned on Singlish for a long time, wanting everyone to speak properly, the people loved it. It was the sound of the melting pot bubbling. It was the sound of a people who had taken a foreign language and made it their own. So, the barriers came down. The walls of language that separate humanity were dismantled, brick by brick, in the classrooms. The island was now connected. Internally, the races could talk to each other. Externally, the nation could talk to the world. They had the infrastructure. They had the discipline. They had the language. Now, they needed a gateway. They needed a front door that was so impressive, so welcoming, that the world would not just visit, but would never want to leave. They needed to build an airport, but not just any airport. By the late 1970s, the world was beginning to notice Singapore. Businessmen were arriving. Tourists were curious. But the first thing they saw when they landed was Paya Lebar Airport. It was a functional airport, but it was trapped. It was located in the middle of the city, surrounded by houses. Every time a plane took off, the roar deafened thousands of residents. And worse, there was no room to grow. Lee Kuan Yew and his advisors looked at the projections. They saw that air travel was going to explode in the coming decades. They needed a gateway that could handle not just millions, but tens of millions of people. They faced a massive decision. They could try to expand the old airport, demolishing hundreds of homes. Or they could do something radical. They could abandon the old airport entirely and move everything to the eastern tip of the island, to a place called Changi. At the time, Changi was a quiet coastal area with coconut palms and a colonial military base. To build an airport there, they would have to reclaim land from the sea. They would have to move mountains of earth. It would cost billions. The experts were divided, but the decision was made: move to Changi. It was one of the largest single construction projects in the country's history. They leveled hills to fill the sea. They built a massive runway that stretched out into the ocean, so that planes would approach over the water, sparing the city the noise. But the physical construction was only half the story. The true genius of Changi was in its philosophy. In most countries, an airport is a place of stress. It is a place of long lines, harsh fluorescent lights, hard floors, and shouting security guards. It is a place you want to escape. Singapore decided to build an airport that people would want to stay in. When Changi Airport opened in 1981, it shocked the aviation world. Step inside Terminal 1 as it was then. The first thing you notice is the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Most airports echo with the clatter of suitcases and footsteps. But at Changi, the floors were fully carpeted. This was a controversial decision. Critics said, "Carpet in an airport? It will get dirty. It will be impossible to maintain with thousands of people walking on it." But the government insisted. Carpet absorbs sound. It makes the space feel soft, hushed, and domestic. It creates a subconscious feeling of calm. When you step off a long-haul flight, exhausted and jet-lagged, the silence of the terminal wraps around you like a blanket. Then, there was the smell. They didn't want it to smell like jet fuel or cleaning chemicals. Changi is famous for its subtle signature scent, a blend of orchid and spice that is pumped into the air. It is fresh and invigorating. And, of course, there were the gardens. True to the garden city vision, they brought the jungle inside. They built indoor koi ponds, where heavy, golden fish swam lazily beneath wooden bridges. They planted real trees inside the terminal. They created a butterfly garden, where 1,000 tropical butterflies fluttered around passengers waiting for their connecting flights. It became a sanctuary. But for a weary traveler, the most relaxing thing of all is not a butterfly. It is efficiency. The Changi experience was designed to be frictionless. The goal was simple. From the moment the plane door opens to the moment you're in a taxi, it should take no more than 20 minutes. Imagine the choreography required to make this happen. As your plane taxis to the gate, the baggage handlers are already waiting. The systems are computerized and precise. By the time you have walked through the cool, silent corridors and cleared immigration, which takes seconds, the carousel is already turning. Your bag is there. There is no waiting. There is no anxiety. It works like a Swiss watch. This obsession with excellence turned Changi into more than just infrastructure. It became a national icon. It became a source of immense pride. For decades, Changi has been voted the best airport in the world year after year. But they didn't stop there. In recent years, they unveiled their masterpiece, Jewel. Imagine a giant glass dome connecting the terminals. Inside is a terraced forest valley, rising 5 stories high, filled with thousands of shrubs and trees. And in the center, falling from the roof of the dome, is the rain vortex. It is the world's tallest indoor waterfall. Picture standing there at night. The water cascades down 7 stories, a sheer curtain of white noise that drowns out the world. Light shows play across the water, turning it blue, then gold, then violet. The mist cools your face. You are inside an airport. You are surrounded by shops and restaurants. but you feel as though you are in a magical rainforest. It is the ultimate expression of the Singaporean dream. Order, nature, and commerce, all perfectly blended together. Changi proved to the world that Singapore could do more than just manufacture cheap electronics. It proved they could offer a service that was superior to anything in the West. It proved they could be hospitable, efficient, and visionary. It became the first hand that shook the hand of every investor. And it was a handshake that said, "Relax, we know what we are doing." So, the gateway was open, the world poured in, and with the world came the money. The 1980s and 90s were arriving, and the third world label was about to be left behind in the dust. The economic boom was beginning. The foundation had been poured, the walls had been built, the garden had been planted, and now, as the 1980s turned into the 1990s, the roof was raised. This was the era of the Asian tigers. The world watched in amazement as a handful of Asian economies, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, began to sprint. They moved with a speed that defied the textbooks of Western economists. But among them, Singapore's sprint was perhaps the most disciplined, the most calculated, and the most transformative of them all. To understand the magnitude of this change, you have to look at the skyline. If you were to stand at the waterfront in the early 1970s, the tallest buildings were modest, colonial structures, perhaps 5 or 6 stories high. They were solid, respectable, but grounded in the past. By the mid-90s, they had been dwarfed by giants. The banking district, Shenton Way, became a canyon of glass and steel. These were not just office buildings, they were monuments to confidence. Imagine standing at the foot of one of these towers, the UOB Plaza or the OUB Center, and looking up. The sheer verticality is dizzying. The glass reflects the passing clouds and the tropical sun, turning the buildings into shimmering pillars of light. Inside, the atmosphere changed completely. The old offices with their ticking ceiling fans, wooden desks and piles of paper were gone. In their place came the hushed, carpeted sanctuaries of high finance. The air in these new towers was cool, filtered, and silent. The big local banks, DBS, UOB, OCBC, grew from local moneylenders into regional powerhouses. Foreign banks flooded in from New York, London, and Tokyo, eager to park their wealth in the Switzerland of the East. The air in the city changed. It no longer smelled of rubber and copra. It smelled of money. It smelled of opportunity. But while the bankers worked in the towers, the true engine of this growth was still the water. Singapore's geography had not changed. It was still the gatekeeper of the Malacca Strait, and the Port of Singapore Authority, PSA, became a marvel of logistics that underpinned the entire economy. Visualize the port at night to understand the rhythm of this success. It is a city unto itself, a separate world of industry that never sleeps. The floodlights turn the night into a stark amber day. The massive quay cranes stand like dinosaurs in a row, dipping their long mechanical necks down to the ships. Clang, hiss, thud. The rhythm is hypnotic. Every minute of every hour, a container is moved. There is no pause. The ships come from Shanghai, from Rotterdam, from Long Beach, carrying the physical goods of the global economy. Electronics, cars, clothes, grain. They dock, they unload, they reload, and they leave. It is a ballet of efficiency. The crane operators sit high above the ground in air-conditioned cabs, maneuvering the steel boxes with the precision of a surgeon. The trucks move in orchestrated loops below. Singapore became the busiest port in the world. It was the funnel through which the trade of East and West flowed. And for every box that moved, for every ship that refueled, Singapore took a tiny slice of profit. These tiny slices, multiplied by millions, created a mountain of wealth. This wealth began to filter down to the streets in a way that changed the daily life of every citizen. The sweatshops of the 1960s were fading into memory. The government realized early on that they could not stay a cheap manufacturing hub forever. Other countries like China and Vietnam were opening up. Their labor was cheaper, their land was plentiful. Singapore could not compete on price. So, Lee Kuan Yew and his team pivoted again. They moved up the value chain. They told the factories, "We don't want to just assemble the toaster. We want to design the microchip inside it." They invested billions in education. They built polytechnics and world-class universities. The children of the coolies and the fishermen, who had grown up illiterate or semi-literate, were now graduating with degrees in engineering, computer science, and biotechnology. They were no longer working with their hands. They were working with their minds. Walk through the corridors of the new science parks built in the 1990s. They are quiet, leafy campuses that look more like university grounds than factories. Inside, in pristine white laboratories, scientists are researching cancer treatments, water filtration membranes, and advanced robotics. The Made in Singapore label came to mean high quality, not low cost. As the jobs changed, so did the lifestyle. Wages skyrocketed. The standard of living exploded. In the span of a single generation, a family went from worrying about where their next meal would come from to worrying about which car to buy. This gave rise to the Singapore dream, often jokingly summarized as the 5 C's: cash, car, credit card, condo, and country club. And the temple of this new religion was the shopping mall. Orchard Road, once a street lined with nutmeg plantations and car showrooms, transformed into a paradise of consumption. It became one of the most famous shopping streets in the world. Visualize a Saturday afternoon on Orchard Road in the 1990s. The heat outside is sweltering, the pavement radiating the equatorial sun. But as you step through the automatic glass doors of a mall like Ngee City or Wisma Atria, you are hit by a wall of cold scented air. The noise of the traffic vanishes, replaced by soft background music. The floors are polished marble, so clean you could see your reflection. The shop windows display the luxury of the world: Gucci handbags from Italy, Rolex watches from Switzerland, Chanel perfumes from France. For the people of Singapore, the mall became the new town square. It was where you went on weekends to escape the heat. It was where teenagers hung out, where families had dinner, where couples went on dates. It was a symbol of having made it. Even the grocery shopping experience changed. The wet markets, with their slippery floors, live frogs and haggling, were still there, but they were joined by cold storage and NTUC fair price. These were air-conditioned supermarkets with aisles of neatly stacked products from around the globe. You could buy apples from Washington, lamb from New Zealand, and cheese from Holland. The world had come to Singapore's doorstep. But amidst this boom of consumption, the government kept its steady, cautious hand on the wheel. They were terrified that the people would become soft. They were terrified that the wealth would disappear as quickly as it had come. So they saved. They enforced a culture of thrift on a national level. They built up massive national reserves, a rainy day fund of hundreds of billions of dollars. It was a secret number, guarded closely by the government and the president, but everyone knew it was there. It gave the country a deep psychological sense of security. It meant that if a financial crisis hit, as it would in 1997, Singapore had a shield. They could pay their way out of trouble. They were not beholden to the IMF or foreign lenders. They were sovereign. The title of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs sums up this era perfectly, from third world to first. It was not a boast. It was a statement of statistical fact. They had looked at the metrics of the West: infant mortality, literacy, GDP per capita, life expectancy, and they had matched or beaten them. A child born in Singapore in 1990 had a better chance of surviving infancy than a child born in New York. A student in Singapore scored higher in math than a student in London. The trains ran on time. The streets were safe at night. The water was drinkable. The basket case of Southeast Asia was now a role model. However, this success brought a new physical problem: space. The island was full. The factories, the airport, the reservoirs, the housing estates, the malls. They took up almost every square inch of available land. Singapore is only 700 square kilometers. It is a tiny red dot. The government looked at the map. They saw the congestion. They saw the need for more housing, more offices, more parks. But there was nowhere left to build. They looked at the sea that surrounded them, the calm blue waters of the Singapore Strait. And they decided, once again, to do the impossible. If they couldn't find more land, they would create it. They would command the sea to retreat. They would build their future on sand that wasn't even there yet. We have spoken of building up, the skyscrapers and the high-rise flats. But now, we must speak of building out. By the 1970s and 80s, the government of Singapore faced a hard mathematical limit. The island measured roughly 580 square kilometers. That was it. That was the entire chessboard on which they had to fit housing, industry, airports, reservoirs, and nature reserves. As the economy boomed, the chessboard became crowded. There was simply no room left to place the next piece. In most countries, when a city runs out of space, it spreads into the countryside. But Singapore is an island nation. There is no countryside. There is only the sea. So, the engineers looked at the shallow waters off the coast. They looked at the maps, and they decided to challenge the very shape of the earth. They began the massive, multi-decade project of land reclamation. To understand the scale of this, imagine a map of Singapore. Since independence, the country has grown by almost 25%. That is not a typo. 1/4 of the Singapore you see today did not exist when the British left. It was water. It is a feat of terraforming that rivals anything in science fiction. But the process itself is slow, rhythmic, and strangely hypnotic to watch. It begins with sand, mountains of it. For decades, fleets of massive barges moved through the waters of Southeast Asia. They carried sand dredged from the sea floor or imported from neighbors. They were like a convoy of ants carrying the building blocks of a new world. Visualize the technique known as rainbowing. A large dredging ship anchors off the coast. A giant nozzle is aimed at the target area. Then, powerful pumps shoot a mixture of sand and water through the air in a high, graceful arc. It looks like a solid, golden rainbow. The sand piles up, rising above the waves. Slowly, a new island emerges from the blue water. But you cannot build on loose sand. It is too soft. It would sink under the weight of a building. So, the land must be prepared. It must be cooked. Engineers insert thousands of vertical drains into the new sand, long wicks that go deep down. Then, they pile heavy earth on top to squeeze the water out. And then, they wait. This is the part of the story that requires patience. For years, these vast, flat expanses of sand just sit there. They look like deserts in the middle of the ocean. The wind blows the sand. Seagulls land on it. It is silent land, waiting to become solid. It takes years for the ground to settle, but the government was always thinking 20, 30, 50 years ahead. They were creating land for a generation that was not even born yet. The first and most famous example of this magic trick was on the East Coast. In the 1960s, the sea lapped right up against the houses of the Katong area. People had seaside villas. They could walk out their back door and step into the waves. Then the machines came. They worked day and night. The sea was pushed back, hundreds of meters. The people who lived in the seaside villas woke up one day to find that the sea was gone. In front of them was a massive new highway, the East Coast Parkway, and a sprawling new housing estate called Marine Parade. Imagine the confusion, and then the acceptance. The ocean view was replaced by a view of progress. Marine Parade became the first housing estate built entirely on reclaimed land. Thousands of people moved into flats that stood where, just a few years earlier, fishermen had cast their nets. But to give back to the people, the government built a park on the outer edge of this new land, East Coast Park. Picture a weekend at East Coast Park. It is a 15-kilometer stretch of reclaimed land. It is lined with tall casuarina trees that whisper in the wind and coconut palms that lean over the water. It is the playground of the nation. You see families cycling on tandem bikes. You smell the smoke of hundreds of barbecue pits where satay is grilling. You see people camping in tents, looking out at the ships anchored in the strait. It is a man-made beach, created from imported sand, protecting a man-made town. Yet it feels natural. It feels like a breathing space for the crowded city. But not all reclamation was for housing. Some of it was for pure industrial muscle. Look to the southwest of Singapore. Originally, there was a cluster of 7 small swampy islands. They were tiny, barely habitable. The engineers looked at these 7 dots and said, "Let's connect them." They poured millions of tons of sand into the channels between the islands. They filled the gaps. Slowly, the 7 islands merged into one massive landmass. This became Jurong Island. It is a place that few tourists ever see, but it is the beating heart of Singapore's economy. It is a petrochemical hub. Visualize Jurong Island at night. It looks like a scene from a futuristic movie. It is a labyrinth of silver pipes, distillation towers, and spherical gas tanks. Thousands of lights twinkle on the steel structures. Flares burn bright orange against the dark sky, burning off excess gas. It is a fortress of industry, sitting on land that was stolen from the sea. Major companies like ExxonMobil and Shell built massive refineries here. They turned Singapore into one of the top oil refining centers in the world, despite the fact that Singapore has no oil of its own. But the crowning glory of reclamation, the masterpiece, is Marina Bay. If you look at a photo of the Singapore city centre from the 1970s, the financial district ends abruptly at the water's edge. The Fullerton Hotel, the old post office, stood right by the harbour. Today, if you stand at the Fullerton, the water is far away. In front of you is a massive expanse of new land. The government reclaimed this land in the 1970s and 80s, but they left it empty for a long time. It was a grassy field, right in the prime centre of the city. Developers begged to buy it. They wanted to build condos, malls, offices immediately. But the government said, "No, not yet." They were waiting for the right vision. They treated this land like a blank canvas. They wanted to create a new downtown that would define the 21st century. This reclaimed land is where the iconic Marina Bay Sands now stands, the three towers with the ship on top. It is where the gardens by the bay now bloom. And in a final feat of engineering genius, they didn't just reclaim the land, they reclaimed the water too. They built a barrage, a dam, across the mouth of the Marina Channel. It separated the seawater from the river water. Over time, the rain flushed out the salt. The salty harbor turned into a freshwater lake. Think of the audacity of this. They pushed the ocean back to build the land. Then they walled off the ocean to create a giant reservoir of drinking water right in the middle of the city. It turned the city center into a water catchment area. It meant that the beautiful blue lake you see reflected in the glass skyscrapers is actually a survival resource. It is water for the taps. The psychological impact of this expansion cannot be overstated. For a small nation, land is usually a fixed constant. You have what you have. But in Singapore, land is a variable. It is something that can be manufactured. It gave the people a sense that their destiny was in their own hands. If they needed space, they would make it. If they needed water, they would catch it. They were not victims of their geography. They were masters of it. Stand now, in your mind's eye, on the roof of the Marina Bay Sands. Look out over the edge of the infinity pool. Below you lies the gardens by the bay. Those metal super trees, covered in living plants, are standing on reclaimed soil. Look further out to sea. You see the line of ships on the horizon. And beyond them, you see the dredgers still working. Still spraying sand, still building. The map is still changing. The story is still being written in sand and stone. The sea, which was once a threat, a barrier, and a separator, has been tamed. It has become the foundation for the future. We have built the land. We have built the economy. We have built the identity. But as the 21st century arrived, Singapore realized that being rich and efficient was not enough. A city of concrete and money can be cold. To be a true home, it needed a soul. It needed to be exciting. It needed to be futuristic, yet soft. And so, we move to the final phase of our story. The creation of the city in a garden, a place where technology and nature merge into something the world had never seen before. We have journeyed through the mud of the kampongs, the smoke of the factories, and the dust of the reclamation sites. Now, we arrive in the present day. Or perhaps, it feels more like we have arrived in the future. By the turn of the new millennium, Singapore had solved its survival problems. It was wealthy, it was safe, it was efficient, but the government felt that something was missing. The city was viewed by the world as a bit sterile, a place of strict rules and hard work, but not much fun. It was a client city, functional but unexciting. They wanted to change the narrative. They wanted to transform Singapore from a place where people came to work into a place where people came to play. They wanted to create a skyline that would make the world gasp. And so, they looked at that prime piece of reclaimed land we spoke of, Marina Bay. It was the crown jewel of their real estate, sitting right at the mouth of the new freshwater reservoir. They invited architects from around the world to dream. The result was Marina Bay Sands. It is impossible to talk about modern Singapore without talking about this building. It has become the new icon, replacing the Merlion as the symbol of the nation. Visualize it in your mind. 3 massive towers, sloping gently as they rise, 57 stories into the air. They are clad in glass that reflects the changing mood of the sky. blue in the morning, silver at noon, gold at sunset. But the true marvel is what sits on top. Resting across the heads of these three towers is a massive, boat-shaped structure. It is called the Sky Park. It is longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. Think of the engineering audacity required to lift a ship into the sky and place it on top of three skyscrapers. It was a ballet of steel and mathematics. The structure had to be flexible enough to sway in the wind, yet strong enough to hold hundreds of trees, restaurants, and a swimming pool. Ah, the pool. The infinity pool. Let us go there now. Imagine stepping out of the elevator on the 57th floor. The air is warm and breezy. You walk to the edge of the water. The pool stretches for 150 meters. There is no visible wall. The water seems to flow right over the edge, dropping down into the abyss of the city below. Swimming here offers a sensation unlike anywhere else on Earth. You are floating in cool blue water, but your eyes are level with the tops of the other skyscrapers. You look down at the financial district, the DBS Tower, the UOB Plaza, and they look like toys. You see the cars moving like ants on the Marina Coastal Expressway. It is a feeling of total detachment. You are swimming in the sky. As the sun sets, the lights of the city flicker on. The pool turns into a glowing ribbon of blue. It is the ultimate statement of luxury and success. The nation that once struggled to find drinking water now swims in a pool in the clouds. But if Marina Bay Sands is the palace of luxury, what lies behind it is the temple of nature. This is Gardens by the Bay. The government had evolved its vision. They no longer wanted just a garden city, a city with parks. They wanted a city in a garden, a city nestled inside a park. They took 101 hectares of prime land that could have been sold for billions to build condos, and they dedicated it to plants. But this being Singapore, they didn't just plant a normal park, they engineered a super park. Walk with me now into the grove of the super trees. These are not real trees. They are man-made structures, steel skeletons that rise up to 50 meters in height. They fan out at the top like giant alien mushrooms or futuristic umbrellas. But they are alive. The steel skin of the super trees is covered in a vertical garden. Over 162,000 plants, bromeliads, orchids, ferns, and flowering climbers hug the metal frames. They are a fusion of biology and technology. The trees harvest solar energy during the day. They collect rainwater to irrigate the plants. They act as exhaust vents for the air conditioning of the conservatories below. And at night, they come alive. Picture the Garden Rhapsody light show. It is 7:45 p.m. People are lying on the grass beneath the super trees looking up. The music starts. Perhaps a waltz, perhaps a movie soundtrack. The trees begin to pulse with light. They turn deep violet, then electric blue, then neon pink. The lights dance in time with the music. It feels like you are standing in the forest of the movie Avatar. It is magical, surreal, and deeply relaxing. Next to the super trees are two giant glass domes that look like seashells resting on the grass. These are the cooled conservatories. Step inside the first one, the cloud forest. The moment the glass doors slide open, the temperature drops. You are no longer in the tropical heat. You are in the cool, misty air of a mountain. Immediately, you are confronted by a 35-meter-tall man-made mountain covered in lush vegetation, and cascading down from the top is a massive waterfall. It is the world's tallest indoor waterfall. The sound of the water crashing down is thunderous and soothing. A fine mist floats in the air, cooling your skin. You take an elevator to the top of the mountain and walk down on the cloud walkways that hang in the air. You are surrounded by pitcher plants, rare orchids, and ferns that usually only grow in the high altitudes of the Andes or Kinabalu. Singapore has effectively built a refrigerator for plants. In a country where it is always summer, they built a place of eternal spring. It shows a mastery over the environment that borders on the absolute. They have created their own weather. Now, zoom out and look at the whole picture of the bay at night. It is a scene of solar punk beauty. You have the glowing curves of the Marina Bay Sands. You have the sparkling, alien forest of the super trees. You have the white lotus shape of the Art Science Museum. And tying it all together is the Helix Bridge, a pedestrian bridge modeled after the structure of DNA, spiraling with LED lights. The reflection of all these lights dances on the calm water of the reservoir. The city feels clean. It feels efficient. But now, it also feels magical. It is a far cry from the smoky, charcoal-filled air of the 1960s. The air here smells of ozone and flowers. The silence is broken only by the hum of electric buggies and the distant music of the light show. This skyline tells the world, the future is not grey. The future is green and blue. It is a vision of how density and nature can coexist. You can have the skyscrapers and you can have the forest right next to each other. As you gaze at this futuristic panorama, it is easy to forget the struggle. It looks so perfect, so finished. It looks as if it was always meant to be this way. But we know better. We know about the mud. We know about the tears. We know about the sand barges. We know that this city in a garden is not a gift from nature. It is a work of art, sculpted by millions of hands over decades of relentless effort. And so, we prepare to leave this gleaming futuristic bay. We prepare to take one last look back at the journey. We have seen the transformation of the land, the water, and the people. But what is the final feeling? What is the emotional core of this story? As the lights of the super trees fade to a soft glow for the night, and the last swimmers leave the infinity pool, we move to our final chapter. A reflection on what it all means. The jewel in the garden. We have reached the end of our journey across time. We have traveled from the muddy banks of a colonial outpost to the glittering heights of a futuristic metropolis. To close this story, let us return to the gateway where the world now enters. Let us stand inside the jewel at Changi Airport one last time. It is late at night. The crowds have gone. The shops are closed. The vast glass dome overhead shows the starry sky of the equator. In the center of the forest valley, the great waterfall, the rain vortex, is still flowing. Watch the waterfall. It drops 7 stories in a perfect, continuous white curtain. The sound is a steady, rhythmic rush. It is white noise made physical. It drowns out the worries of the day. It drowns out the noise of history. As you watch the water, think of what this structure represents. Here lies a man-made waterfall, surrounded by a man-made forest, inside a man-made climate, sitting on man-made land. It is the ultimate symbol of the Singapore story. It is the triumph of will over circumstance. It is a reminder that nothing on this island is accidental. Every tree, every drop of water, every brick has been placed there by a decision. It is a nation built on the refusal to accept the hand that fate dealt it. Let your mind drift away from the waterfall now. Let us take a final, ghostly walk through the sleeping city we have watched grow. Float out of the airport, gliding down the long, tree-lined coast of the East Coast Parkway. The rain trees that line the highway have folded their leaves tight for the night. They are sleeping. The bougainvillea bushes are dark silhouettes against the streetlights. To your left, the ocean is calm. The ships are still there, anchored in the deep channel. Their anchor lights twinkle like a second city on the water. These ships are the descendants of the old tonkangs and wooden sailboats. They carry the commerce of the world, but tonight they are at rest. The cranes at the port are still. The great engines are silent. Move deeper into the city. Fly over the Marina Barrage. Look down at the water in the reservoir. It is glass still. It holds the reflection of the moon. This water, which was once salt, is now sweet. It is the lifeblood of the city, captured and cherished. It reminds us of the vulnerability that started it all. The fear of thirst that drove a people to greatness. That fear is gone now, replaced by a quiet confidence. Drift over the gardens by the bay. The super trees are dark now. Their light show finished hours ago. They stand like silent sentinels, watching over the plants. The air here is cool, oxygenated by the millions of leaves breathing in the night. Move into the canyons of the financial district. The skyscrapers of Shenton Way are dormant. The trading floors are empty. The screens are dark. These towers, built on the sweat and savings of a generation, are solid. They are not going anywhere. They stand as monuments to the discipline, the rugged society that Lee Kuan Yew demanded. The man in white is gone now, passed into history. But his spirit is built into the steel of these towers. The clean streets, the order, the safety. They are his legacy, humming quietly in the background of the night. Drift further, out of the city center, into the heartlands. Fly over Toa Payoh, Anjumokio, Queenstown. Look at the HDB blocks. Thousands of white rectangles rising into the sky. In the 1960s, these places were mud and kampongs. Tonight, they are homes. Look at the windows. Most are dark. The people are sleeping. Inside these flats, the air conditioners hum softly, the sound of modern comfort. Think of the people sleeping inside. There is the grandmother, who remembers the bucket system and the riots. She sleeps soundly, her old fears soothed by the safety of her home. There is the father, who works in a high-tech factory in Jurong. He sleeps knowing his job is secure. His CPF savings are growing. There is the child, dreaming of school tomorrow, a school where they will pledge to be one united people. A child who speaks English, who navigates the internet, who sees the world as their oyster. They are safe. They are secure. They are the beneficiaries of the miracle. It is a profound feeling to realize how far they have come. From a basket case with no future to a jewel of the world. From a place of tears to a place of dreams. Reflect on the colors of the story we have told. We started with the brown of the mud and the river. We moved to the gray of the concrete and the factories. We added the green of the trees and the parks. We added the blue of the clean water and the sky. And finally, we added the gold of prosperity and light. It is a finished painting, a masterpiece of nation building. But even in this moment of peace, there is a gentle reminder. Singapore calls itself the little red dot. It is a reminder of its smallness. A garden must be tended. If the gardener walks away, the weeds return. The jungle is always waiting at the edges, ready to reclaim the land. The ocean is always waiting to erode the sand. So, even as the city sleeps, the systems are working. The water is being filtered. The power plants are humming. The police are patrolling the quiet streets. The vigilance never truly stops. But you do not need to be vigilant tonight. You can let go. You can borrow the peace of this city. Imagine that you are lying in one of those high apartments. You are high up, safe in the fortress of the sky. The window is slightly open. You can feel the soft tropical breeze. It is warm, moist, and comforting. It smells of rain and jasmine. You can hear the distant, muffled sound of a single car driving down a highway miles away. It is a lonely, rhythmic sound that fades into silence. Whoosh. The city is a cradle. It holds you. Everything is in its place. The trains are in the depots. The money is in the vaults. The water is in the reservoirs. The ships are at anchor. There is no chaos here. Only order. There is no noise here, only silence. There is no struggle here, only rest. Think of the rain tree again, the great spreading tree that lines the boulevards. Picture its leaves, tiny, green, oval leaves, millions of them. As the sun went down, they received the signal. One by one they folded. Leaf over leaf, leaf over leaf, closing up, shutting out the world, protecting the moisture inside. Imagine your thoughts are like those leaves, the thoughts of the day, the worries of the past, the plans for tomorrow. Watch them fold up, one by one, closing, folding, resting. The tree is sleeping. The garden is sleeping. The city is sleeping. The lights of the skyline are dimming now. The gold turns to silver. The silver turns to shadow. The lights on the water blur and fade. You are floating in the velvet darkness of the equator. The air is heavy and soft. It presses gently against your skin, like a weighted blanket. It is a first world sleep. Deep, uninterrupted, secure. The journey is over. The work is done. The miracle is complete. From the swamp to the stars. From the mud to the moon. And now, there is nothing left to do but drift. Drift on the calm water of the reservoir. Drift on the quiet air of the garden. The story of Singapore is a story of waking up to a nightmare and working until it became a dream. But now, the dream is real, and you can sleep. Sleep now, safe in the garden, safe in the city, safe in the night. Good night.